I saved nearly 200 lives that day, but 3 children still almost died because of me. Everyone calls me a hero, yet I can't sleep knowing what really happened. The worst part? No one knows the whole story. I will never forget the day I realized my boss would rather protect the camp's image than the lives of 200 kids. It was almost a year ago. 11 months to be exact. And this morning his widow called me in tears, after finding his journals. Have you ever been put in a situation where you had to decide between keeping your job and doing the right thing? I'd been a summer camp counselor for 5 straight years. I'd seen heat waves, storms, even a few close calls with wildlife. But that morning? The sky didn't look real. It had that thick, sickly orange haze, the kind you only see in wildfire photos. And it was before noon. The fire was supposed to be 20 miles out, but ash was already drifting down like gray snowflakes. My group of 12-year-olds kept pointing at the sun, how it looked red, almost bloody, behind the smoke. I rushed to the main office, thinking the director would already be preparing an evacuation. But when I got there, Phillips, the man in charge, was in his office, headset on, pointing at financial graphs for the board of directors, while the Forest Service evacuation alert literally crackled through the radio on his desk. When he finally hung up, I told him straight. The wind was shifting, the fire was coming toward us, we needed to get the kids out now. He got up, patted me on the shoulder, the way you'd calm down a scared camper, and said, "Ryan, I've been running this camp for 15 years. We've never evacuated for a fire 20 miles away. I'm not starting now. Not when parents pay $4,000 a week for their kids to be here." I pulled out my phone, showed him the official evacuate immediately alert. He didn't even read it, just shoved it away. Told me if I mentioned the fire to anyone, especially the kids, I'd be fired on the spot and blacklisted from ever working with children again. By lunchtime, the smoke was so thick that kids were coughing during outdoor activities. The younger ones were in their cabins, crying because their eyes burned. I found 3 other counselors in the dining hall. We all agreed this was insane. But Phillips had locked the van keys in his office, and the camp buses needed special keys only he and the drivers kept. Then we saw it, actual flames high on the ridge maybe 2 miles away. And the wind was pushing it right toward us. I sprinted back to Phillips's office. He was on the phone with parents, assuring them the media was exaggerating and that their children were perfectly safe. I pointed out the burning ridge and told him we had maybe an hour, tops. That's when he slammed his hand on the desk and yelled, "You're just a college kid. You don't understand liability or reputation. If you start a panic and a kid gets hurt, we'll be sued into bankruptcy." Right then, the power cut out, the fire had taken down the lines. But he insisted it was just a precaution. That's when I knew, if I didn't act, someone could die. I remembered the janitor once telling me about a spare set of bus keys hidden in the maintenance shed. I bolted through the smoke, lungs burning, vision blurred, until I found them behind the tool cabinet. When I got to the bus lot, another counselor was trying to smash a window with a rock. I held up the keys and told her, "We're leaving now." She burst into tears. We pulled the buses right up to the cabins and started loading kids. I'll never forget this one 8-year-old with a Spider-Man backpack asking if we were going to die, while Ash clung to his hair and shoulders. More counselors joined in once they saw what we were doing. In 15 minutes of pure chaos, we had all 200 kids loaded. Phillips came storming out of his office, screaming that we were all fired, that we'd be arrested for kidnapping. My coworker just pointed behind him. The entire ridge was on fire. You could hear trees exploding from the heat. We barreled down the mountain road, way faster than we should have been going, but the fire was chasing us, leaping tree to tree like it was alive. In my rearview mirror, I saw Phillips running toward the admin building. Later, we learned he'd gone back for the camp's old photographs and financial records. His so-called fireproof safe didn't hold. The last glimpse I had of him, he was dragging boxes toward his car, right before the propane tank behind the kitchen went up, swallowing the building in flames. We made it to the high school evacuation center. Kids were crying, counselors were calling parents. I started doing a head count. First count, 197. That couldn't be right. Second count, still 197. Another counselor and I compared rosters, going name by name. That's when my stomach dropped. 3 boys from the oldest cabin weren't on any list. Nobody had seen them during the evacuation. Somewhere in that burning camp were 3 kids who trusted me to keep them safe. I thought I'd saved every camper that day. Turns out, I'd left 3 behind to burn. My hands were still trembling when the sleek black Mercedes came flying into the high school parking lot, tires squealing. Before the car had even stopped, Linda Morrison was out the door, heels clicking hard on the pavement. She made a straight line for me. And the second I told her that Jake hadn't been on any of the buses, she grabbed me by the front of my shirt with both hands. "You killed my son," she screamed, over and over, while other parents tried to pull her off. And I just stood there, taking it because deep down, maybe she was right. About 20 minutes later, the fire chief found me sitting on the curb, staring at nothing. He crouched down, voice low, and told me the camp was gone. Completely gone. Nothing left but ash and the twisted skeletons of beams. "Search and rescue can't even go in until tomorrow," he said. "Fires still burning in spots. Trees still falling." I barely made it to the gym bathroom before I threw up everything in my stomach. All I could picture was Jake, Ethan, and Marcus trapped in those flames. That night I was sitting in my car, trying to breathe through the guilt, when Sarah tapped on my window and slid into the passenger seat. She told me she'd seen the 3 boys sneaking toward the old mining trail during lunch, way before we even knew we'd be evacuating. The trail led to abandoned copper mines that twisted deep through the mountain. If they'd gone in there, they might have found shelter from the fire. Might still be alive. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept seeing Ethan's inhaler sitting on his nightstand. Marcus's ADHD med schedule pinned to his bunk. All the little details I should have remembered before we pulled out. Their parents trusted us. And I was the one who skipped the final cabin check because I thought every second counted. The next morning I went straight to the search and rescue command post in the school cafeteria. But the coordinator didn't even let me finish. I couldn't join the search. No certification, no gear. But I knew those trails better than anyone. 5 summers at that camp had burned them into my memory. So I drove to a sporting goods store, spent my last $100 on hiking boots and a headlamp. Took the back road toward the mines. There were evacuation barricades. I drove right around them. When the road finally ended in a mess of fallen trees, I got out and hiked. The smoke burned my lungs raw, but 2 miles later I found it, the mine entrance Jake had bragged about during campfire stories. In the ash, footprints. Fresh. Heading straight inside. My pulse started hammering. Maybe they'd made it. A few feet in, I saw a Snickers wrapper. Marcus always had them. I pulled out my phone flashlight and followed the tunnel, calling their names. 20 minutes later, my light caught something small and blue on the ground. I picked it up, Ethan's inhaler. Empty. Ahead, the tunnel split into 3. No clue which way they'd gone. I chose the middle and kept shouting until my throat gave out. I searched for 2 hours before my phone died, and then I had to feel my way back out in total darkness, scraping my palms against the jagged rock. Back at the evacuation center that night, the air was heavy with panic. Parents shouting about lawsuits while their kids just sat there, hollow-eyed. In the hallway, 2 board members whispered about gross negligence resulting in death and whether the insurance would pay out. The next morning, Greg, reeking of whiskey, found me in the parking lot. Said he'd seen the boys too that morning. They'd asked for flashlights to explore the mines. He'd given them 2 and told them to be back by lunch. He kept muttering, "It's my fault. I should have stopped them." I didn't have the heart to tell him he wasn't wrong. Later, Sarah came back with a stack of old geological maps from the library. We spread them across my hood, tracing the mine tunnels. Some connected to natural caves, maybe safe from smoke. But others flooded after heavy rains, and it had poured just 2 days before the fire. The floodwater could have driven them even deeper underground. When I returned to the evacuation center, 3 days had passed since the fire. Linda Morrison stood by the door with a man in a tailored suit. A lawyer, I guessed. She saw me, pointed. The lawyer walked over and handed me an envelope. Linda stood behind him, arms folded tight. Inside, legal documents. They were suing me for depraved indifference, claiming my unauthorized evacuation caused the deaths of 3 minors. Other parents watched from their cars, their eyes like daggers. Linda stepped closer, told me she'd hired her own search teams since I'd failed to save her son. The lawyer said I should get legal representation immediately. This was only the beginning. My hands shook as I walked back to my car. I called my college roommate Mike, he's in law school. Told him everything. He was silent for a long moment before saying I needed a real lawyer fast. But real lawyers cost thousands. Mike thought maybe the camp's insurance would cover me. But when I called, they flat out said no. Anyone acting outside their authorized duties wasn't covered. I was completely alone. No money. No lawyer. No way out. The next morning, I couldn't sleep. My mind just kept looping the same thought. If those boys were still alive, they had to be somewhere deep in those mines. So I went to the library. Sat down at one of those old yellowed public computers and started digging into anything I could find about mine rescues. That's when I stumbled across a 1987 newspaper clipping about 2 kids who'd been trapped in the exact same mine system during a flash flood. They'd survived 3 whole days underground by following a stream to a cave system with natural ventilation, and made it out alive. If Jake, Ethan, and Marcus knew about those caves, maybe, just maybe, they'd done the same thing. Then my phone rang. It was a fire investigator asking me to come to the sheriff's office for an interview. 3 hours. That's how long he questioned me. Every single thing Phillips had done before the fire. How he ignored evacuation orders. How he locked the van keys in his office. How he threatened to fire anyone who tried to get the kids out. The investigator scribbled it all down, then showed me photos of what was left of the camp. One shot made me stop cold, Phillips's office. He told me they'd found his body surrounded by boxes of financial records. The fireproof safe? Melted. Every document destroyed. By day 5, my parents drove up from Denver after seeing the lawsuit on the news. My mom hugged me so tight in the motel parking lot I could barely breathe. She begged me to come home, said I was tearing myself apart over something that wasn't my fault. My dad told me the professionals would find the boys and I needed to take care of myself. But I couldn't leave. I told them I was staying until those kids were found, one way or another. The next morning, the search coordinator called with something we hadn't had in days, hope. They'd found Marcus's backpack 300 yards into the mine. Inside, his ADHD meds, a half-full water bottle, and his dead phone. That meant they'd made it deep enough to escape the smoke. I called Sarah. Within an hour, we had every counselor we could reach sitting around a coffee shop table. We knew things the official teams didn't. Jake always went uphill when he was lost. Higher ground felt safer to him. Ethan stayed near water after he'd had heat stroke last summer. Marcus followed walls because his therapist had taught him it helped when he was overwhelmed. We built our own search grid, each of us taking areas that matched the boys' habits. Day 6, before sunrise, I drove to the ruins of the camp. The painted bus lines were still visible on the asphalt, but everything else was blackened skeletons. I sat on a chunk of concrete, watching the sun bleed through the lingering smoke. In the ashes, I found a warped piece of the camp sign, part of the pine tree logo still visible. 5 summers of my life, gone because one man cared more about money than human lives. Day 7 brought the first real breakthrough. A volunteer team found scratches on a mine wall, low to the ground, kid height, leading toward an old ventilation shaft. The kind of shaft that connected to the cave system I'd read about. They were sending their best team in immediately. That same afternoon, the state fire marshal went on TV. Said if the boys were found dead, Phillips would face posthumous charges for negligent homicide. The camp board instantly released a statement claiming they had no knowledge of his refusal to evacuate. That was a lie. I'd seen him on the phone with them while the fire closed in. That night I couldn't stay still. I drove around the evacuation zone until dawn, scanning every place a scared teenager might hide. Day 8 began with me parked outside the mine entrance at 3 in the morning, just sitting there, trying to think like a 14-year-old who'd gotten separated in the chaos. At some point I must have drifted off, because Greg was knocking on my window at sunrise. His face told me he'd remembered something important. 2 weeks before the fire, the boys had talked to him about finding old mining equipment in a shaft near the creek, a place no official search team would check because it wasn't on any maps. We grabbed flashlights and hiked into the still smoldering forest until Greg stopped at a wall of bushes. He pushed through and revealed a narrow opening in the rock, hidden unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, the beam of my flashlight caught them, footprints. 3 sets, heading deeper. We followed for what felt like forever, ducking through low tunnels, eventually crawling on hands and knees. That's when I heard it, faint, rhythmic tapping. Greg and I tapped back on the rock. Instantly there was a reply, 3 quick taps, too slow. We pushed forward, knees and palms scraping raw on the jagged floor, until the tunnel opened into a chamber where the ceiling had partially collapsed. And there they were. All 3 boys huddled together in the beam of our lights. Ethan was wheezing hard without his inhaler. Marcus's ankle was twisted, and Jake still gripped the metal pipe he'd been using to signal us. They'd been drinking from rock drips, staying calm because Jake had kept telling them rescue stories, making up happy endings to keep their spirits up. It took 6 hours to get them out. The rescue team had to widen narrow spots without injuring Marcus further. When we finally emerged into the daylight, the parents were there. Linda dropped to her knees, sobbing as she clutched Jake to her chest. Then she looked at me over his shoulder, mouthed "thank you," before the ambulances took them away. And for the first time in days, I thought maybe the nightmare was finally over. The day after we pulled the boys from that mine, I spent 8 hours in the hospital waiting room, only to be told I couldn't see them. Their parents had lawyers there, taking statements, locking down access. That's when a detective pulled me aside. Said I was now under investigation for child endangerment, because I hadn't done a proper head count before we left camp, and because my unauthorized evacuation supposedly caused the chaos that separated the boys from the group. The relief I'd felt when they were found alive evaporated. My stomach dropped. This was only the beginning of the nightmare. Within days, the camp's insurance company sent a team of investigators. They spent the next week grilling every counselor who'd been there, circling back to my decision to break into the bus and leave without Phillips's permission. They kept hinting that my panic could have caused injuries. Asking the same questions again and again, like they were hoping someone would change their answer. On day 12, Sarah showed up at my apartment looking like she hadn't slept in days. She told me the investigators had offered her immunity from any lawsuits if she testified that I pressured the other counselors to defy Phillips. She wanted to go to law school. One bad mark on her record and that dream would vanish. She was torn between telling the truth and protecting her future. Phillips trying to save his stacks of financial records while the camp literally burned? That was like combing your hair in the mirror while your house collapses around you. Priorities so backwards, and he'd paid the ultimate price. I drove out to the mine entrance where we'd found the boys, sat there thinking about how they'd survived by using the skills we'd taught them. Marcus mapping the tunnels in his head, hyper-focused on details. Ethan rationing food and water because of what he'd learned from past health scares. Jake keeping spirits up with stories of rescue teams. 2 weeks after the fire, the state investigators' report came out. Phillips had been warned 3 separate times about his lack of evacuation procedures. His defense? The camp was naturally fireproof because of its location in the valley. Now the board was claiming they'd been misled, the same people I'd seen on the phone with him while the fire closed in. Then Linda called. Said she had something important to talk about regarding Jake. Told me to meet her at the Main Street coffee shop. She was in the back corner booth, sunglasses on even though the sky outside was overcast. When I sat down, she slid a folded check across the table. $50,000. Written out to me. Before I could speak, she leaned in close. Told me to take it, disappear, and never talk about the camp again. Her husband was running for state senate. The fact that Jake had been left behind could tank his career. I pushed the check back. Told her I couldn't take money to bury the truth. And her whole demeanor changed in an instant. She stood up, said if I didn't take the deal, she'd make sure I was ruined in court, that I'd never work with kids again. Reminded me her husband owned the local paper and 3 TV stations. Said they could control every word the public heard. Then she tore the check in half, dropped the pieces on the table and walked out. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. 2 days later, I ran into Greg at the gas station. I barely recognized him, older, worn down, reeking of whiskey. He grabbed my arm, said he needed to tell me something. He'd known Phillips was wrong about not evacuating. But he'd kept quiet because Phillips threatened to fire him if he took my side. Greg had worked at that camp for 20 years. It was all he knew. And now, he said, he felt like he'd sold out every kid's safety for a paycheck. Later, while packing up my apartment because I couldn't make rent, I found my old counselor training manual in a box of camp junk. The margins were covered in Phillips's handwriting, little notes about maintaining parental confidence and protecting reputation above all else. Next to the emergency protocol section, he'd scribbled, "Scared parents don't pay." Beside the safety guidelines, perception matters more than reality. That's when it hit me. From the moment I started working there, he'd been training us to put image and money before safety. And we'd all just accepted it. The state's formal investigation dropped a week later, and it was worse than anyone imagined. 10 years of falsified evacuation drill reports, claiming we'd done monthly drills when we'd only done 2 each summer. Money meant for fire extinguishers and first aid gear had gone straight into his personal bank account. The board members swore they'd known nothing, even though they'd signed every budget, every report. Then the DA's office called. They were charging me with 3 counts of child endangerment for leaving Jake, Ethan, and Marcus behind. My court-appointed lawyer laid it out: plead guilty, take 2 years probation and sign a gag order, or fight it and risk 5 years in prison. She said with the Morrison family's influence in this town, beating the charges would be next to impossible. I was sitting in my car, staring at the steering wheel, wondering if I should take the plea deal, when my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't know. The message was from Jake, using a burner phone. He said his parents were forcing him to lie about what happened in the mines. They wanted him to claim he didn't remember how they got there. Then he sent me a recording. His dad's voice, calm but cold, coaching him word for word on how to spin the story, making it sound like harmless confusion during evacuation, not that they'd been left behind. "Protect the family's reputation," his dad kept saying. "Telling the truth will destroy my campaign, make us all look bad." Jake said it made him sick, but if he didn't play along, they'd ship him to a military school out of state. 2 days later, I met with Ethan's parents. His mom hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe. His dad kept thanking me for saving his boy. They wanted to help me fight the charges, but they were undocumented. Any public involvement could get them deported. Ethan's mom pressed a small metal pendant into my palm, "St. Christopher, the protector of travelers." "For protection," she whispered. Tears in her eyes. It was all they could do without risking their family's future here. That night, Sarah called. She decided to tell the truth no matter what it cost her. She gave a deposition to state investigators, said Phillips had flat out refused to evacuate and threatened to fire anyone who tried. Within hours, the camp's lawyers came for her. They dug up a minor drug charge from her freshman year and painted her as unreliable. The next morning, Linda's husband's paper ran a front-page hit piece, "Troubled former counselor with history of drug use." Then Marcus's foster parents contacted my lawyer. They had no money for legal help, but they wanted to support me. Marcus had drawn precise, detailed maps of the mine tunnels from memory, showing exactly where they'd hidden, where they'd moved. His autism had literally saved their lives, but at camp, he'd always been written off as a behavior problem. The next morning, I got a call from a woman who said she'd been a counselor in 2018. She told me Phillips had pulled the same stunt before, refusing to evacuate during a smaller fire threat 3 years earlier. She had emails proving 3 board members were in the room when he ignored the warnings. When she sent them over, I printed every single one. 12 emails where Phillips called evacuation orders government overreach, and the board agreed reputation mattered more than theoretical danger. I brought them straight to my lawyer. She said this could change everything. 2 days later, the local news ran a segment calling me the rogue counselor who traumatized 200 children with an illegal evacuation. Linda sat on camera, all polished smiles, saying, "He acted without authority and created more danger than the fire itself." No mention that Phillips refused to evacuate. No mention the camp burned to the ground 20 minutes after we left. Overnight, Pine shut its doors to me. No restaurants, no stores would hire me. The EMT training program rejected me, citing pending legal matters, even though I'd passed every test. With less than $2,000 in my account and my parents already in debt for my legal bills, I was sitting in the library trying to figure out how to pay rent when Jake walked in. Baseball cap low, like he didn't want to be recognized. He slid into the seat across from me, pulled out his phone, and hit play. It was the recording again, his dad coaching him on exactly what to say in court to make me look guilty. Jake's hands were shaking. He said the nightmares hadn't stopped, reliving the darkness, the smoke, while Phillips kept assuring parents everything was fine. But his parents had already signed paperwork saying he'd testify against me. The very next day, I was served with more papers. This time, the camp board was suing me for defamation, claiming I invented stories about Phillips refusing to evacuate to cover up abandoning the boys. My lawyer told me fighting both cases would take at least $50,000 I didn't have. 5 days later, at my arraignment, the courtroom was packed, parents, reporters, cameras everywhere. That's when Jake stood up in the gallery and shouted, "He saved my life!" Security moved fast. His parents grabbed at his arms. But he kept shouting over them, voice cracking, "He's a hero! Phillips almost killed us." I'll never forget the sound of every reporter's camera clicking at once. The judge pounded his gavel, warning against further disruptions, but it was too late. That night, every local news channel had the same footage, Jake's face, his voice, under a headline asking if the star witness was being coached to lie. The next morning, Sarah called sounding breathless. She'd been digging through old camp paperwork and found something massive, the smoking gun. Turns out, the camp carried 2 insurance policies. One for acts of God like wildfires and another for human error. But that second one? It specifically excluded gross negligence. By refusing to evacuate, Phillips had basically voided both. Which meant neither policy would pay a cent. The board members would be personally on the hook for millions in damages. Sarah had already sent copies to 3 reporters, and suddenly, journalists who'd been ignoring us were calling non-stop. 2 days later, Greg knocked on my door. For the first time since the fire, his eyes were clear, he'd quit drinking. He told me something he'd been sitting on for weeks. The morning of the fire, Phillips had a breakfast meeting with big donors. Greg had been fixing the conference room door and overheard him bragging that their kids would get an authentic wilderness experience no matter what. Then Phillips said something that still makes my skin crawl: "A little smoke builds character." Greg still had the work order proving he was there, plus the donor list Phillips had dropped on the floor. I spent the next 2 days holed up in the library, digging through legal archives. I found 17 other cases where summer camps ignored evacuation orders, and in every single one, the directors ended up facing criminal charges. Then a lawyer from Denver called. Said she'd take my case for free. Her nephew had died at a Wyoming camp that refused to evacuate during a flood. She said the pattern was always the same, camps choosing money over safety, until kids paid the price. 2 days later, the fire investigators' final report came out. It said Phillips's refusal to evacuate had directly endangered 200 children, and that his own death was the result of prioritizing property over human life. The board instantly put out a statement claiming Phillips had misled them about the fire's proximity. But Sarah had already handed reporters text messages proving they knew exactly how close it was, and told him to keep the camp open anyway. The very next morning, I turned on the news, and there was Linda's husband, standing on the courthouse steps with a wall of cameras in front of him, announcing his run for state senate while holding up a photo of Jake. He spoke about accountability and protecting our children. Said people like me should never be allowed near kids again. Linda stood beside him, dabbing her eyes for the cameras. By noon, the video had 50,000 views. The comment section was a dumpster fire of people calling me a monster who deserved prison. Day 43, I had to get groceries. Walking through Pine felt like walking through my own funeral, like I was a ghost haunting a town that had already buried me. Parents grabbed their kids and pulled them away when I walked past. The cashier I'd known for 3 years wouldn't even look at me. The local paper ran my mugshot on the front page again, using the same arrest photo where I looked like I hadn't slept in days. That afternoon, my lawyer called. She'd found something huge in the discovery file: emails between board members about a $1 million donation from a tech company. The catch? They'd only get it if the camp finished the full summer season without interruptions. One email even calculated exactly how much money they'd lose per day if they evacuated, and how that loss would be less than the cost of potential lawsuits. Phillips hadn't been freelancing. He'd been following direct orders to keep the camp open, no matter what. One board member had even written, "Weather events are temporary. Donors remember everything." 2 days later, Marcus's foster mom showed up at my door with a folder full of his drawings. She spread them out on my table, maps of the mine tunnels, labeled in perfect handwriting, showing exactly how they'd found water by listening for drips, how they'd kept warm by huddling together. Everything I'd taught them in wilderness training. She said Marcus wanted me to know they were alive because of me. The next morning, my lawyer called again. The other parents were now filing a civil suit against me for emotional trauma, claiming their kids had PTSD from being kidnapped during my unauthorized evacuation. She told me point blank, defending both the criminal and civil cases would drain every penny I had, and most people in my position would already be filing for bankruptcy. 3 days later, Jake's recording from the mine leaked to a wilderness disaster podcast. Within 4 hours, it went viral, 2 million plays. His voice told the real story: how my lessons had kept them calm, how Phillips ignored the fire orders, how the truth had been twisted. His dad went on TV, threatening to sue the podcast and anyone who shared the audio. But it was too late. People were starting to ask why I was being punished for saving kids. That night, Sarah came over with her laptop. She'd found a video from a parent's phone, filmed during the evacuation. You could see Phillips standing in his office window, just watching. The timestamp was 20 minutes after the evacuation order. For 12 straight minutes, he never moved. Never came outside to help. Never gave a single instruction. Just stood there with his phone pressed to his ear while we ran around trying to get 200 kids to safety. Sarah's screen recorded everything before it could disappear. 2 days later, I sat across from the court-appointed trauma counselor. She was the first person in weeks who didn't look at me like I belonged in prison. She told me flat out, evacuating had saved 197 lives. And the only reason the 3 boys survived was because they used the survival skills I'd taught them. She said survivor's guilt was common, but in my case misplaced. After our session, I went out to my car and just sat there, crying for 10 straight minutes, because for the first time someone told me I wasn't a monster. The very next day, 2 former summer counselors contacted my lawyer. One had emails from Phillips himself saying, parental revenue exceeds potential lawsuit costs, after she raised concerns about dangerous, outdated gear. Another had audio recordings of him bragging that insurance would cover any injuries, so there was no need to cancel activities, even during severe weather alerts. My lawyer said this wasn't a one-time bad decision. This was a 15-year pattern. And the board had let it go on because Phillips kept the camp profitable. On day 53, the prosecutor called with a new deal. They'd realized the board's liability was huge and wanted witnesses willing to testify about the camp's culture of negligence. If I agreed to testify against the board, they'd drop every charge against me. My lawyer said it was my one real shot at avoiding prison. We needed evidence, so I started calling everyone from camp. No answer from Greg. Then, on day 54, Sarah called sobbing. She'd heard Greg had been served with his own lawsuit, and no one had seen him since. I drove out to the ruins of the camp. The place still smelled like charred wood, even after all these weeks. Greg's truck was parked near the old maintenance shed. He was slumped in the driver's seat, an empty whiskey bottle on the floor. In his hands, papers crumpled and soaked from his tears. They were meeting notes from 2 years ago. The board had openly discussed the fire risk and chose not to clear brush or update evacuation plans because insurance will cover any losses. I snapped photos of every page and called Sarah to help me get Greg to the hospital. While we waited for the ambulance, he kept mumbling, "I should have said something sooner." Day 55 brought something I didn't expect: Ethan's parents on local TV. Despite being terrified about their immigration status, they sat there telling the world how I'd taught Ethan to find water and stay put if he got lost, lessons that saved his life in the mine. When the reporter asked if they blamed me, Ethan's mom just shook her head. He was the only adult who cared more about the kids than keeping his job. The story exploded online. Headlines started calling me the counselor who saved 200 kids. But I couldn't even look at them. It didn't feel right, not with 3 boys almost dying. I drove out to the memorial someone had put up at the camp entrance. Phillips had literally spent the morning of the fire talking about building character through smoke exposure, while kids were coughing and crying in their cabins. The board had sat around calculating whether lawsuits would cost less than losing donor money. Someone had spray-painted "child killer" in red across Phillips's photo. I just stood there, staring, feeling hollow. The local paper was still calling him a hero who died trying to protect camp property. I knew better. 3 days later, day 58, I was making dinner when someone knocked. It was Jake. Huge backpack. Eyes red from crying. He came inside, dropped the bag on my table, and out spilled printed emails, USB drives, even a tiny voice recorder. He'd been recording his parents for weeks because he couldn't stomach the lies anymore. One recording had his mom admitting she knew I wasn't to blame. Jake looked me dead in the eye and said, "We saved each other that day in the woods." We were going through the emails when the front door slammed open. Linda stormed in with 2 cops behind her, screaming that I was kidnapping her son. Jake stood up and told them he'd come here willingly, because his parents were forcing him to lie. The officers froze when he played them the audio of his dad coaching him on exactly what to say to investigators. They told me they had to take him home since he was still a minor. But as they walked him out, one of the officers leaned in close and whispered, "Make copies of everything before we leave." Day 60, that's when the tide started to turn. A group of parents whose kids survived held their own press conference on the courthouse steps. One mom held up a photo of her daughter and said, "I'd rather have a kid with PTSD who's alive than a dead kid who followed protocol." Another dad said he'd looked up the evacuation timeline, and if we'd waited for official approval, the buses would have been driving straight through active flames. That same day, the state attorney general's office announced they were opening an investigation into the camp board's finances. By day 63, they'd already found millions of dollars that should have gone towards safety equipment and emergency training, sitting in board members' personal accounts. Sarah called me that morning. She'd gotten into law school, but was deferring for a year to help with my case and the civil suits. "This whole thing made me realize the kind of lawyer I want to be," she said. "The kind who protects people who do the right thing." The prosecutor finally approved supervised visits with Marcus, Ethan, and Jake during their therapy sessions. Seeing them alive in that hospital room, it made the nightmares a little easier to live with. The ones where I'm always 5 minutes too late. Marcus didn't say much, but he handed me a drawing, the 3 of them huddled in the cave, "Thank you," scrawled at the bottom. 2 days later, on day 65, Greg walked into the law office, sober, steady, ready to give his deposition. He carried 3 boxes of maintenance records, every time Phillips denied requests for emergency gear, every time he refused to clear evacuation routes. 5 straight years of Phillips saying the camp couldn't afford safety updates, while approving bonuses for board members. The prosecutor's team grilled him for 6 hours. Greg never flinched, even when they brought up his drinking. The next morning, the board members arrived at court, but this time, each had their own lawyer. The man in charge of finances pointed at the woman handling donors and said she'd known about the fire risks for months. She fired back that he was the one who told Phillips to ignore the fire marshal. Then the third board member, a retired banker, pulled out his phone and started showing emails where the other 2 discussed how to hide safety violations from state inspectors. Within minutes, they were screaming at each other in the hallway while their attorneys tried to shut them up. My lawyer yanked me into a side room so we could watch through the glass as they basically demolished each other's defense in real time. The finance guy admitted on camera that they all knew Phillips was dangerous but kept him because he brought in donations. The donor relations woman admitted they'd talked about evacuation plans, but decided practicing them would hurt the camp's image. The banker claimed he'd just been following orders. By noon, each of them had filed separate lawsuits against the other 2. My lawyer showed me the updated liability numbers, $40 million and climbing. 2 days later, I sat in my car outside the courthouse for 3 hours before I could make myself go inside. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't drink my coffee. Tomorrow was Jake's testimony. My lawyer kept saying we were ready, but also warned me his parents might accuse me of coaching him. Walking into that building, I couldn't stop wondering if I'd be walking back out in cuffs. Inside, Marcus appeared on the video screen from his hospital bed. His lungs were still damaged from the smoke. He held up his drawings of the cave shelter, explaining every single survival step I'd taught them: how to find water, how to stay warm, how to mark your path. The prosecutor tried to spin it like teaching them survival skills was reckless, but Marcus shut him down. He read from his notebook, where he'd written down my fire safety rules word for word. His mom was crying behind him as he said, "Those skills kept us alive for 18 hours in a burning forest." Then the judge asked him directly if he blamed me. Marcus looked straight into the camera and said, he was the only adult who actually tried to save everyone. After court, I was heading to my car in the parking garage when Jake's father cornered me. He glanced around, making sure we were alone, then admitted he knew I'd saved Jake's life, and that he was grateful. But then his tone changed. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket and said he'd drop the civil suit if I signed an NDA promising never to talk about him coaching Jake to lie. It'll save us both a lot of trouble, he said. And legal fees. I stared at the paper, a way out of a $10 million lawsuit, and handed it back. Told him the truth mattered more than money, and that Jake deserved better than a father who'd make him lie under oath. His hand clamped down on my shoulder hard enough to bruise. I pulled away, got into my car, and drove off, leaving him standing there, still holding that paper. The next morning in court, the camp's attorney was cross-examining our fire expert when he slipped. One sentence, that's all it took. He mentioned that the board had override authority during emergencies. My lawyer shot up so fast his chair tipped over. He demanded the camp's bylaws right there on the record. The judge argued with both sides for 30 minutes before finally ordering them to produce the documents immediately. And there it was, in black and white. Any board member could override the director's decisions in an emergency threatening camper safety. The camp's lawyer tried to walk it back, but it was too late. It was now part of the official record. My lawyer didn't hesitate. He filed a motion to dismiss all charges against me, pointing out that 3 board members had the legal power to evacuate, and chose not to. The prosecutor looked like someone had punched him in the gut. 2 days later, we were called back to court. The judge spent an hour flipping through the evidence while I sat there gripping my knees so hard they ached. She grilled the prosecutor, asking why I was being charged when I'd gotten 197 kids to safety and risked my life to save the 3 who were missing. He kept repeating that I'd violated my duty of care by leaving those boys behind initially. The judge wasn't having it. She pulled up the timeline, pointing out that I'd had less than 15 minutes before the fire hit the camp. How, she asked, is anyone supposed to conduct a perfect head count in that kind of chaos? Then Linda was called to the stand. Within 5 minutes, she was sobbing so hard the bailiff brought her tissues. She admitted she'd been protecting her husband's image as a high-profile corporate lawyer by forcing Jake to stick to the story that I'd abandoned them. From the gallery, Jake stood up and walked to her side. No one stopped him. He took her hand and told her it was okay to tell the truth now, that Dad would understand. Linda looked at the judge and said she wanted to retract every single statement blaming me. She admitted Jake had told her the truth weeks ago, but she'd been too afraid to confess she'd lied. Her husband stormed out of the courtroom, slamming the door so hard the bailiff followed him. 2 days later, Sarah called me, her voice bright for the first time in months. The other counselors had started a GoFundMe for my defense. It had already passed $50,000. Parents who'd hated me were donating and leaving messages saying they'd been wrong. Even friends of the board members were giving money and demanding justice. Then the local news called. My inbox filled with messages from former staff, each with their own story of Phillips and the board ignoring safety warnings. A janitor from the board's office reached out and said he had something that needed to be seen in court. He brought in security footage from the morning of the fire. The video showed all 3 board members in their conference room, champagne glasses in hand, toasting over paperwork. The audio caught one of them saying they needed to keep the doors open no matter what to lock in a donor commitment. The timestamp? 2 hours after the evacuation order for our area. The janitor had another clip, the board watching news coverage of the fire and laughing about how Phillips would handle it. When my lawyer played it in court the next day, the gallery erupted in gasps. 2 days later, the prosecutor stood up and announced that the state was dropping every single charge against me, effective immediately. And then he turned around and announced that all 3 board members were being charged with criminally negligent homicide. The courtroom exploded, parents and counselors clapping, cheering, crying. The judge banged her gavel over the noise, but no one stopped. Me? I just sat there numb. My brain couldn't process that it was over. Outside, reporters swarmed me, shouting questions about how it felt to be cleared. I walked right past them. My lawyer kept patting my back saying, "We won." But winning didn't bring back the camp. It didn't undo Phillips's death, or the fact that 3 kids had spent the worst night of their lives in a cave, because the people in charge cared more about money than safety. When I got home, I didn't celebrate. I just sat on my couch, staring at the wall, ignoring the buzzing of my phone as Sarah, my parents, and friends sent messages I couldn't answer. 2 weeks later, Jake's dad was all over the evening news, announcing he was dropping out of the Senate race. Why? Because someone had leaked the recordings. The reporter played them on air, his voice coaching Jake, step by step, on exactly what to tell investigators about the fire. How to pin everything on me. How to make it sound like I'd panicked, created chaos, and put kids in danger. And then you heard Jake's voice getting smaller and smaller as he repeated the lies his dad fed him. That same day, Jake went on social media and posted a long message. Thanking me. Saying I'd taught him that telling the truth mattered more than protecting powerful people. Later that night, his dad called me, screaming down the line that I'd destroyed his career, his family, his life. The next morning, Greg called from rehab, where the other counselors had helped check him in. His voice was shaking, choked with tears. He told me giving those boys the flashlights had haunted him for months, that he'd been drinking himself to death thinking about what could have happened. But knowing they'd survive because of those lights, it was the only reason he was trying to get better. Then something I never expected started happening. Emails, phone calls, messages from camps all over the country. They wanted to hire me. They wanted someone who would put kids' safety first no matter what. It felt surreal. Like I'd almost gone to prison for doing the bare minimum, and now that same decision was suddenly a selling point. 3 months passed before the board members' trial began. Their defense? They trusted Phillips completely. Claimed they weren't fire experts, that they'd relied on his decades of experience. The prosecutor shredded that argument. Email after email came up in court, showing them explicitly telling Phillips to avoid evacuations that might trigger refund requests, to prioritize happy parents over safety protocols, to remember the camp's 100-year reputation was more valuable than overreacting to every little forest fire warning. On day 5, one board member cracked on the stand. He broke down sobbing, admitting they'd all known Phillips would never evacuate, that they'd chosen him because he was obsessed with the camp's image and would do anything to protect it. He named every board member who'd sat in meetings where they'd agreed evacuations were bad for business. Said they'd decided it was better to risk a lawsuit than lose summer revenue, figuring the fire department would force them out if it got bad enough. The insurance company eventually settled with the families, amount sealed, but word spread. Millions per family. The board members weren't so lucky. They were sued personally. Their houses went up for sale. Their businesses were boycotted. 2 moved out of state because people screamed at them in grocery store aisles. That October, Sarah drove me up to what was left of the camp. The air still carried the faint smell of charred wood. The flagpole was still there, somehow, twisted, bent but upright. Sarah rested her hand on it and said, like us. Bent but not broken. At sentencing, the judge let Jake, Ethan, and Marcus speak. The room went dead silent when those 3 teenagers stepped up to the microphone. Jake talked about trust, about learning that some adults would let kids die to protect their image. How that knowledge had changed him forever. Ethan's voice shook as he described the terror of being trapped in that cave, thinking they'd suffocate in the dark. Marcus stared directly at the board members and told them he still woke up gasping from nightmares about the fire. That he couldn't go camping anymore because even the smell of a campfire made him panic. The judge paused for a long moment before delivering the verdict. Guilty on all counts, criminally negligent homicide for Phillips's death, and child endangerment for every single camper. 2 of them got 5 years in prison. The oldest got house arrest for health reasons. Watching the bailiffs put them in cuffs, it felt both empty and necessary. Outside, Linda was waiting. Tears on her face. She grabbed my hands and apologized for blaming me when Jake first went missing. Told me she was starting a wilderness safety foundation and wanted me to help run it. 3 weeks later, the state passed Phillips's law, mandatory evacuation protocols for all camps, with 0 financial incentives for staying open during emergencies. A bitter legacy for a man who'd died guarding paperwork instead of people. But at least something good had finally come from all that horror. The foundation offered me a full-time role, training counselors in emergency response. I accepted without hesitation, because I knew my first lesson would always be the same. Your job is to protect children, not profits, not reputation, not tradition. Just children. And nothing else matters when their safety is on the line. Before I moved for the new job, Jake, Ethan, and Marcus met me at a coffee shop to say goodbye. They slid a small box across the table. Inside was a compass. On the back, engraved words, "Thank you for helping us find our way out." I had to look away so they wouldn't see me crying. Greg was sober now. He'd become the caretaker of the memorial where the camp once stood. He said it was his way of remembering what happens when good people stay silent. Every week, he tends to those grounds like it's a promise to never look away again. Sarah called the following week with news. She'd passed the LSAT with almost a perfect score. She was going to law school to become a child advocacy attorney. We promised to stay in touch. We both knew we'd always be connected by that day. We chose children over orders, and paid the price for doing the right thing. Some nights I still wake up counting to 200, making sure I didn't miss anyone. The smoke damage to my lungs will never heal completely. Every breath is a reminder of that orange sky and ash falling like snow while children asked if we were going to die. The boys' parents invited me to their joint birthday party next month. It'll be awkward, sure, but we're all trying to move forward from trauma that never had to happen. If anyone had just listened to that evacuation order instead of calculating profits, none of this would have happened. 2 months later at my new camp, I ran my first unannounced evacuation drill. The director complained about lost activity time, until I showed him photos from Pine Ridge. Burned buses. Destroyed cabins. The memorial wall with Phillips's name etched in it. He approved monthly drills on the spot. No arguments. And I made sure every counselor knew exactly where the spare keys were kept. Now I watch my new campers learning how to build emergency shelters, and I think of Jake, Ethan, and Marcus surviving in that cave using those same lessons. Every child I train carries forward what Pine Ridge taught us. When someone tells you to ignore danger for convenience, image, or money, you save lives first. You face the consequences later. The scar tissue in my lungs aches every time I take a deep breath during training exercises. But I'm breathing. They're breathing. And 200 children went home to their families. That's what matters. Not the job I lost, not the threats Phillips made, not the lawsuits. Just that every single kid we loaded onto those buses made it home alive, because we chose their lives over everything else.